I know there is a link between that image and what I'm about to say. I just don't know what it is yet, but we can return to that. Yeah, I just arrived here in Gdansk in February, so this is a way for me to think about what it means to arrive here as a Norwegian, sent by the Norwegian government. You will know that Norway and Denmark has a common history up until 1814. Thomas Kingo was a poet then who could be said to be a common heritage of Norway and Denmark. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Pascal. We'll return to that. Gdansk is in some ways a veritable shrine to the Baroque period. Not only is the town littered with the richly ornamented facades from the period, the entire Tri-City area harbors a dense church population, the most prominent of which are found in the old city of Gdansk, with some grandiose structures from around the 17th century. The rhetorical efficacy of the ornamentations in churches from this period was, of course, their outward display of power. The way they were to demonstrate how God's authority in this world was a force of the exterior. And this kind of argument, sedimented as it were in bricks, wood and mortar, was enlisted in opposition to the growing movement of Reformation, a movement that claimed God's work was not exterior to his followers, in the sense that it was not something imbued on believers from the outside by certain privileged clergymen, but rather a force that each believer encountered by himself, as if from within the subject. The Reformation is often considered a profoundly democratic force, as it encouraged believers to actively acquire and read the scripture themselves. In this way, Martin Luther's Reformation brought with it a growth in literacy, also among people who had no other use for this skill than to make their own investigation into the words that hitherto had been the monopoly of the priesthood. This is why today, when we encounter the campaign for reform in the speech of power, it is curious that this term has acquired an almost opposite value. Gone are the great reform movements of the 19th century. It is no longer a matter of bringing books or culture to the great masses of the people. Instead, reform is now almost solely about what we have become familiar with as austerity measures. Let's look at one example. It's been clear for some time that Western economies have been facing a situation where one would have to choose between cuts in welfare or increased taxes. This is why, about a year ago, critics such as George Monbiot, a well-known British writer, suggested an increase in the property tax in the UK. Now, the British Parliament is not discussing Monbiot's proposal, but are instead implementing a tax on recipients of public welfare that have a room more than they strictly need, the so-called bedroom tax. As Monbiot points out, this reform entails a radically increased tax burden for those with the smallest share of their country's wealth. In the meantime, property tax for the rich goes unchanged. How is it at all possible to achieve support for these kinds of policies in elections? Policies that damage the financial interests of the vast majority of voters. Our suggestion here is that one clue to an answer is found precisely in the work of these 17th century artists. Perhaps what we need today is not so much another reform as another counter-reformation. Let's turn, therefore, to catch a brief glimpse of the poetry of Danish Baroque master Thomas Kingo. In the words of Kingo, vanity is the first curse of mankind, a vice that traps us under the yoke of forces that do us no good. Everything is vanity to Kingo. Our striving for earthly wealth, flattery and friendship, our accumulation of symbolic recognition, even our worries, our sorrows and pleasures, they're all but vanity. In comparison to the sun itself, they are but reminders of our ephemeral existence, our vain efforts to hold time still. It is here that we should keep in mind cultural critic Slavoj Žižek's definition of postmodernity, not as something that follows after modernity, but as a residue within modernity itself. In the case of Kingo, the postmodern moment emerges when vanity takes the place as that which unites early modern with contemporary sensibilities. Is vanity today not precisely the ideological drive to perfectionism? One is reminded of Raúl Castro's latest speech to the Cuban National Assembly, where he put forward the view that the current caretakers of his country are not to tear down what has been put together since the revolution, or to invent something entirely new, but to perfect his country's already socialist system. More seriously, is vanity today not our tendency to seek compliance with the ideal image of the class climber, a person, or even an entire society, forever moving upwards, aspiring to be a winner in the social game? I'm just going to quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, a well-known American writer, who writes that the American assumption was that wealth is mainly the result of its owner's efforts, and that any average worker can by thrift become a capitalist. But the post-Civil War transformation of the corporate and industrial economy make the ideal harder than ever to attain. Yet the great American assumption promoted the idea that men who were failures simply lacked the ability, the ambition, or both. What has once been said of the captives of slavery now belittle the misfits of capitalism. Losers. This is a game which surely must produce many more who don't win, and by what Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe termed the antagonistic logic of equivalence, must defeat itself once those who have not reached the top realize that their downfall is constituent of the winner's gain. Our vanity, then, secures the continued putting into play of this dangerous game that produces very few winners and an increasingly destitute majority. It is a game that has been charged with being responsible for a crisis-ridden economy, as well as a crisis-ridden ecological system, and finally, and most relevant to our analysis, it is productive of a subjectivity that will always remain at its heels, so to speak, never catching up with itself, but forever at odds with its own conscience. This is the modern version of Thomas Kingo's cursed sentiment in the poem on Vanity. Let us wind back a little bit to the contemporaneity of Kingo's poem. As a key achievement of the Baroque epoch in Scandinavian poetry, Kingo epitomizes a possibly dark and gloomy view of man as forever chasing his own shadow. The world is lit by a false glow. What makes us tick is in fact the cause of our own doom. It is our sense of pride, our inability to renounce our ideal images and be content with our actual here and now existence. Should we not in this respect be reminded of a contemporary of his, Blaise Pascal, who towards the end of his short life, weary of the treadmills of mathematical formulae, turned away from his, up until then, scientific endeavors and faced the existential bare-knuckledness of life. All men seek happiness, he says, and yet everyone complains. Princes and subjects, noblemen and commoners, old and young, strong and weak, learned and ignorant, healthy and sick, of all countries, all times, all ages, and all conditions. We experience a trial so long, so continuous, so uniform, that it should convince us of our inability to reach the good by our own efforts. But example teaches us so little, Pascal writes. And here he strikes the precise tangent that Kingo later elaborates into a symphony. Pascal asks, what is it then that this desire and this inability proclaim to us, but that there once was in man a true happiness, of which there now remain to him only the mark and empty trace, which he in vain tries to fill? It is this vanity then, this invainity, that unites Kingo with the thoughts of Pascal. We already know it. What is in vain can never give us a sense of satisfaction. It is, as we know from the philosophy of language, a tautology. Now, while Kingo and Pascal perceived vanity as an essential characteristic of the human psyche, does this sentiment now, in our secular post-religious order, receive a new meaning, a different Bedeutung, perhaps inaugurated by Thackeray's Vanity Fair, finding its continuation in the perhaps surprisingly progressive pursuits of the current editor of the magazine bearing the name of that famous early 20th century novel, and finally making a different and somewhat new sense in our contemporary and, as Zizek would have it, eminently postmodern world. If vanity is no longer an essential attribute of what it means to be human, it has been made available to contingent articulation. It appears, surfaces at some moments, only to float away, disappearing between our fingers like some fluid we try to lift from a basin. As Zygmunt Bauman would have it, it is our contemporary condition. Signifiers float, they cannot be captured. And, pays Pascal, it is our vanity that seduces us into thinking that they can be held fast, steadily in some absolute solid space. Vanity, then, is that while the narrative of globalization renders a world that is increasingly networked, knit together, available to consumption and profitability, it produces within itself pockets of antagonistic forces, such as fundamentalist resistances, for instance. When it is claimed that the Al-Qaeda was in fact set up and produced by the United States to combat the Soviet-governed Afghanistan in the 1980s, it returns as an antagonist to its founders, its author, and remains a sort of paradoxical reminder of a modern condition that can never be whole, never complete, and as it produces its own resistances, it remains precisely postmodern. Similarly, while our vanity serves as a reminder, a trace of our early modern condition, it also enables us to enter into what Agamben has referred to as a condition of non-active release, a doxiological anapausis. And this way, or mode of existence, we can perhaps only begin to grasp through the vehicle of Kierkegaard's ethical leap. Agamben would perhaps call this an effective breakdown of the social, where we begin to leave vanity behind and realize the full potential of our social current circumstance, frail with dangers and fraught with possibilities. Thank you.